Yeah, so this is a talk from the Murray Technical Governance team on verification and confidence building mechanisms for international coordination, specifically around building advanced AI. So the main motivation for this talk and this whole idea is that international coordination around AGI will in fact require the nations to be confident that other nations aren't breaking the rules. It's a pretty normal concept. Everyone needs to be confident everyone's not breaking the rules and everything's fine here. And there are many examples I know throughout normal international institutions of nations agreeing to these verification and confidence building mechanisms. Throughout this talk, I'll discuss various nuclear treaties and the agreements that these entail, and the confidence and verification building mechanisms within them, as well as various chemical and biological weapons treaties. This is just a pretty normal thing within various international relations stuff. I think it's pretty important to realize that we already have some existing methods for doing this kind of thing, and maybe we can just apply those to governing AI. In general, I think we should kind of expect things to be normal in some sense, where if there is an established way to do things, that's probably how things will go by default. So if we have established confidence building mechanisms, those will probably be the first things that international treaties first rely on. In this talk, I'm pretty excited to show, hopefully relatively concretely, that there just are a bunch of pretty useful verification mechanisms, and hopefully nations will be able to trust each other as we develop this very transformative technology. These are also often imperfect, but the aim of these in practice is to incentivize all of the actors to comply enough with the agreements. Everyone you want to align your incentives such that it's pretty hard to be defecting, and so everyone kind of trusts that all the incentives are aligned and we can all be happy and all the children sing. Centrally in this talk, I'll be considering national or international AGI projects, kind of the kind that are discussed in Leopold's situational awareness. So I'm not really discussing private competition between DeepMind or OpenAI. There could definitely be public-private partnerships, but centrally, yeah, I'm talking about coordination between nations. I think coordination between different companies is still very important, but a different question, and is the kind of thing that probably can be somewhat better dealt with by domestic laws rather than international coordinations and treaties. Nice. So in this talk, there's kind of three parts. I'll give some overview and some case studies around various international agreements to kind of give a flavor for what kind of things actually happen as this kind of as we attempt to design these agreements. I found this pretty useful for me. I'm reasonably new to the space. I'm oh wow, international agreements work like that. That's something I didn't know. And maybe this will be useful for various people, hopefully. Then I'll give an overview of what I think this international coordination around AI specifically could look like, and give some pointers to what the agreements might be, how you might and how you might do some things. And then I will get into the big long list of various verification mechanisms that can be used for building this that verification mechanisms that can be used around building advanced AI. And so hopefully everyone can trust each other. Right, so let's kick off. So now I'm getting into the portion where we're discussing what is international coordination? How does that work? So in general, there's kind of two main types of agreements that people might be, or that various nations might be making. There's these multilateral agreements, which are between many different nations, and then there's bilateral agreements, which are between two specific nations. Throughout this talk, I'll mainly be considering bilateral agreements between the US and China, as they seem to be the two main players when it comes to developing AGI. There are obviously other nations that are important, but most of these are pretty aligned with these two nations, and so I think it seems pretty likely that bilateral treaties seem a great option if we can achieve them. Yeah, so for multilateral treaties, there's a bunch of examples of these, many treaties and organizations, a bunch of examples of these. Most of these, many of these contain almost all of the UN member states. And so that's pretty great. You can get pretty big, broad international buy-in. But these also often make decisions by consensus, which makes them slow and like very conservative, and like, I don't know, it seems brutal to actually get like kind of intense things done. They also notably often don't have hard power. And so the way that like if someone's like breaking the agreements is that they'll just like report various violations to the Security Council, but they themselves can't like send in the sanctions or whatever. When it comes to bilateral agreements, the main function here is like allowing trust between the two nations. Yeah, again, like the aim here is like coordination. Each nation in these bilateral treaties ideally like wants to go along with the terms of the deal, so long as the other nation does. But there's like no third party enforcer. And so like if this verification fails, like someone is defecting or they somehow lose confidence, then like rather than like the third party enforcer like coming in and doing something, the primary outcome is that like the treaty gets broken and both parties start breaking it. So hopefully we don't ever end up in that situation. They could potentially call up the UN Security Council, but unfortunately, in most of these cases for these bilateral agreements that I'm considering, both the US and China are members of the Security Council. And so, yeah, this is not you can't really tell the Security Council to do something. Yeah?
Like, just about what makes these bilateral agreements have these two? Is it like, if you break this agreement, I will stop trading with you? Or like, what are some of these other reasons why people might want to not break?
Yeah. So I think there is some just like, I know, yeah, you want like trade, maybe two nations go to war. But I think like the primary thing is like Russia or like, so China wants the US to like abide by the agreement, and China wants the US to abide by the agreement. And so like the punishment is that the other one's going to defect on you. There's like I think this is like the primary thing that's going on here. But yeah, obviously like in kind of extreme cases, this can then like flow through to like other things like sanctions, potentially war, but hopefully we can avoid those. Nice. Now I'm going to give a kind of a quick history lesson. I'm going to run over 3 ways that we've attempted international coordination, specifically in the domain of nuclear weapons. I'm going to cover the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is this multilateral organization, and one of its functions is in charge of verification of like a pretty important multilateral treaty. I'll cover the START treaties, which has some like international agreements between the US and Russia started in the 90s, which I think were like surprisingly awesome, although there were some difficulties and are some difficulties here. And the Baruch Plan, which was this plan from the 1940s for the control of nuclear weapons and nuclear technology, which planned for the total centralization of nuclear technology and the abolishment of all nuclear weapons. I'm mainly bringing up the Baruch Plan to show that like historically there have been some like crazy ambitious coordination schemes, and this was actually just like the main plan that the US was attempting. And so like even though it failed, I'm like, this kind of thing has historically been on the table, and maybe it can be on the table again in AI, but we'll see how it goes. Cool. So the IAEA is this international organization. The main purpose is to promote the peaceful use of nuclear energy and limit its military purposes. It's got like, it's founded in the 50s, and it's got many member states. Almost all UN members are members. The most notable one who's not is North Korea, who withdrew in 1994. But other than that, I think basically all relevant nations are part of the IAEA. And they do verification for this like non-proliferation treaty, which involves like going into various nations, inspecting their nuclear facilities, making sure that these facilities are used for civilian purposes without building like unauthorized nukes. They have like over 800 inspectors like employed by the organization, and they go around the world inspecting various places, and hopefully everyone's playing by the rules. They notably have limited enforcement power. So like if a nation is found to be in violation, the main thing that they do is like contact the Security Council, and then maybe the Security Council will do something. Although hopefully that's like after a bunch more inspections, and like, yeah, you don't want to initially be calling the Security Council. That's kind of a last resort action. We also have the START treaties, which are a series of agreements between the US and the Soviet Union, and later Russia, where the aim of these treaties was to reduce the number of nuclear weapons held on both sides. So like in like the 80s and 90s, they're like, wow, we have like so many nukes, these are like not useful, and just like the more nukes we have, this just like makes the world much more dangerous. And so these two nations agreed to these treaties, which like involve like progressively lowering the number of nuclear weapons and their deployment mechanisms. This treaty like importantly has a bunch of verification mechanisms so that each nation can be confident that the other nation is like reducing their weapons by like the agreed numbers. We also have these like regular forums to like discuss implementation, clear up ambiguities, which I think are like pretty important because I know the real world is complicated and often there are ambiguities here, and you don't want countries to like go to war over like small disagreements. Yeah, so these started the negotiations in the early 80s, and for the first one, the negotiations took until 1991. But other treaties, these negotiations took less time. But yeah, sometimes negotiations can take like a decade, which is like pretty rough. And so hopefully for AI, things don't take that long. Yeah, there are a bunch of other ones. START 2 was like signed, but due to the US pulling out from a separate treaty, Russia pulled out from this treaty. It was a whole thing. So hopefully we want to avoid this kind of thing as well. Currently, the new START treaty is in effect, which like limits the number of nuclear weapons on both sides. Although in February 2023, Russia suspended its participation from this treaty related to the Ukraine war stuff. And like in response to this, US revoked visas to Russian inspectors in the US. So we'll see how this treaty like continues to be in effect in the next like months or years. Yeah, until February 2023, it seems to be going great, but I know international relations is difficult. And then we have the Broad Plan. So this is this plan from 1946 for global governance of nuclear technology. And this was notably the main plan that the US was putting forward for governing nuclear technology. The plan basically proposed to create an agency which would have like a total monopoly over nuclear materials. So like all uranium and thorium, all the mining, refining, enrichment. They would control all of like the nuclear reactors. The plan would eliminate all nuclear weapons, which seems like kind of crazy today, but this was in fact just the main thing. This was the thing that people thought was possible at the time. The plan would also, like have a bunch of sharing of scientific information, promoting the peaceful use of nuclear technology, hopefully ushering in this nuclear-powered utopia. And it would establish various safeguards to hopefully catch defectors in case someone was building like nukes. Unfortunately, this plan ultimately failed. Notably, the US wanted Russia to give up the Russian nukes first, while the US initially retained theirs. Russia kind of understandably wasn't super okay with this. And there are also like various technical assumptions in the plan that made it like they were like incorrect, like related to the mining of uranium and various like facts about can you make uranium safe for civilian purposes but not military purposes. But I mainly bring up like the Broad Plan because I think it like demonstrates that nations just like can put forward extremely ambitious plans. And like if this plan had worked, I think there's a pretty high chance that we today would live in a world without nuclear weapons. Yeah.
Can you go into some of the background of the Broad Plan? Like who was the initial person put forward, or how did this happen within the US?
Yeah, okay. Yeah. So the plan initially started, there's a different report called the Acheson-Lilienthal report. I think Lilienthal was the Secretary of State at the time, or maybe Deputy Secretary of State, and Acheson was a scientist. And they were tasked with like design. They recently in like 55 or whatever, 45, something around there, the first nukes had been dropped, and they're like, wow, this nuke stuff seems like a really big deal. And the US was like, all right, we need to get together a plan to make sure we don't end up with a nuclear apocalypse. And so yeah, these two guys, Acheson and Lilienthal, produced this report. And then Bernard Baruch, who the Baruch Plan is named after, was a statesman and also like an industry man who had a bunch of money and also a bunch of like international clout, like kind of changed their plan a little bit and like came forward with the Baruch Plan. And this plan was put forward to like various United Nations committees as like the main thing. Because of like the US wanting the Soviets to give up their missiles first, the Soviets weren't okay with this, and then the Soviets proposed like an alternative plan, which I think was like probably mainly a propaganda thing to make it look like the US was also defecting. And then like the negotiations went very badly. And then we never ended up with any organization like this. It was very sad. But hopefully we can avoid this kind of thing in the future.
Yeah. Quick question about the IAEA. I guess I have the impression that lots of countries still do have nuclear weapons, like India and Pakistan, Israel, and so on. Is that more of a failure of like the sort of like the enforcement mechanism you were talking about with the UN, or the verification thing?
Yeah. So I think like the initial thing is signed up to like with this like non-proliferation treaty to avoid this happening. I think initially there was in fact like this treaty where like things were getting set up and proliferation was in fact pretty difficult. I think like recently this has become like a bunch more difficult, and like basically I know Iran's been doing this a little bit, maybe Pakistan, but like I think it's like much more difficult to develop nuclear weapons than like it would be without this agreement. But yeah, I agree that's like unfortunately pretty imperfect.
Well, are there like limits of nuclear weapons which you can't surpass, or like what, like how is that governed?
So I guess I think under the non-proliferation treaty, which I don't fully know the details, the idea is to hopefully just like limit the number of additional countries that like develop nuclear weapons, while also allowing like other countries to develop nuclear technology for like civilian purposes. But I think the idea is just we want to have like limit the number of like nuclear armed states in the world. Yeah. Cool. So now hopefully we all understand all of the aspects of international coordination. We understand what everything looks like, and we can move on to applying this to AI. So one of the first things when applying this to AI is there are obviously like various goals that such an international agreement could have. Some of these are based around the risks associated with AI development, such as like misalignment risks and this kind of thing, while other like of goals of such agreements could be based around like nations' individual interests and not wanting like the gap between different nations to become too big. Like one specific scenario which I often imagine is that China really would not be happy if the US economy is growing at say 20% per year and the Chinese economy is only growing at 3% per year. I think within a decade of this happening, China's kind of left in the dust, and like if China foresees this coming, it seems pretty plausible that they would take pretty strong actions to avoid this happening. Yeah, I'm also pretty worried about race dynamics here, where like two countries are like moving really quickly to avoid falling behind, and so don't really have time to like stop and consider the risks, and instead of too focused on this like international race dynamic, and so therefore misalignment risks, this kind of thing. We also want to avoid these kind of like unilateralist cursed dynamics, where like the most incautious actor like builds the dangerous system, and even though everyone else was like trying to play by the rules, someone was like, oh no, misalignment seems fake, I'm just going to build a big AI. And in these worlds, like, yeah, when it comes to existential risks, yeah, these unilateralist cursed dynamics really bite. Yeah, so I think nations could have agreements around not training models which are like dangerous in various ways. Obviously, we want to like avoid these misalignment risks. We want to avoid nations individually, maybe not me, but we'll take no comment here. Want to avoid giving one nation like some overwhelming military advantage, or similarly, want to avoid one nation having an overwhelming economic advantage. Yeah, as I said, like. This risk where one nation is like rushing ahead economically, and so unfortunately, maybe fortunately, I don't know, other nations will always have this like fallback option of war, like potentially including nuclear war. So like if China sees that the US is going to become overwhelmingly economically dominant, it seems pretty plausible that they prefer war over just like becoming just like extremely small and insignificant compared to the US. And then I think pretty much all states will want to avoid like powerful models being stolen by malicious actors such as non-states or rogue states. Seems like a pretty broadly agreeable goal. Yeah. From a more positive perspective, I think these agreements will also be about sharing like the benefits of powerful AI. Like, I think if this goes great, it goes really great. And I think like such an agreement should really like allow for this. So now we like, I know, have some overall sense of what kind of goals such an international agreement might have. We now need to work out like how to achieve these goals. What like are the actual terms in the treaty that people are agreeing to? I think like a rather obvious point is that the verification mechanisms that like the treaty has obviously have to be like appropriately tailored to depend on what the agreement actually is. Like if your agreement is about like having a maximum number of trading flops, we need a way to verify that, and like satellite imagery or whatever isn't particularly useful for doing that. Here we've got some list of like various things that the agreement could require. I obviously don't know exactly what the agreement's going to be like made of, but it seems pretty likely that it'll like contain most or some of these. Yeah, maybe there's other things that should be on this list. I'd be excited if people have further thoughts here. But yeah, so I think like such an agreement could put a limit on the number of trading flops for various models, which is kind of what we do today. This feels like pretty imperfect to me, and ideally we move on from here. But given like the bad state of evals and knowing model capabilities, this seems like kind of rough. We can also like have agreements for nations to only like produce compliant hardware. Okay. So if nations are like producing hardware, some international agreements may rely on specific like hardware features. And so there might be like agreements to only produce hardware with these certain features, such as like, yes, we can always do like location verification of the chips. And you can never produce a chip that's like powerful and doesn't have these like location verification measures. I think there'll also be agreements hopefully based on like capabilities of the models, either like dangerous or military capabilities, which nations could just like agree not to build, or like, I think maybe more important to me is the general AI capabilities. Both because I think these like general AI capabilities are dangerous in their own right, especially when we currently don't have like the alignment techniques to actually like use these safely, especially as these systems become powerful. But also I think this like general AI capabilities thing aligns with like avoiding one nation becoming overwhelmingly powerful compared to the others. Yeah. Ideally, like eventually we get around these like misalignment risks by using these like affirmative safety cases, actually having an argument, why is the system safe, rather than just like relying on the system being kind of bad in various ways and then just assuming that it's not dangerous. Yeah, I think it's pretty plausible that nations will also just be limited by the amount of computing hardware that they're allowed to have, in a similar way to how we're like, various nations are like limited to the amount of like uranium that they're allowed to have, or like the amount of like deployed nuclear weapons. I expect these will like require like safety and security standards, like seem like to avoid like malicious actors doing stuff, but also to avoid misalignment risks again. I think this seems like pretty similar to the IAEA just enforcing like normal nuclear safety standards within nuclear facilities. And then potentially we can like agree to only like run certain algorithms, or like not run certain algorithms potentially. For example, we're like, yes, no long horizon RL, no like recurrent transformers. We've all agreed that these things are dangerous. Don't do them. And maybe this is a bit of a dream for me, but I think it's like, yeah, maybe a thing that these international agreements could eventually require.
Oh,
cool. So now we can move on to the actual verification mechanisms. The reason you all came here today. So I think like a pretty basic thing in like all of these verification regimes or confidence building regimes are just inspections. And these are used in a bunch of things like, as well as like the nuclear things, they're like biological weapons, chemical weapons, and like financial stuff, medical stuff. I think it's like pretty common to just like send in some people to be like, yes, are you abiding by the rules? And this is like, it's the most basic thing to expect here. There's three main types of these, like ad hoc inspections, which are inspections like when the agreement first starts to make sure like initially you weren't lying, to make sure you weren't like hiding your like million H100s or something. And then these ad hoc inspections also happen if something big changes. For example, when you get like a big in shipment of chips, we have like routine inspections, but just like normal inspections scheduled some number of times through the year to make sure everyone's like still playing by the rules. And then like special inspections, which if someone is like suspicious or there's like some like uncertainty, something needs further verification, you like send in some people at pretty short notice to make sure things are okay. potentially on like a scale of hours. I think the main things to inspect are like going to be data centers, chip fabs, AI labs, and the models themselves. Yeah, these inspections will likely be gameable. Like, I know you can always fool the inspector. You can be like, oh, don't look over there. Look, it's under a tarp. Don't look. Yeah. And so I think you need like other confidence building mechanisms to like give confidence that these inspections are like adequate or like not missing important things. Cool. So what would we do about like inspections of data centers? And there's a few things here that seem like pretty great and pretty like doable. I think like possibly they just like look at the chips and be like, the inspectors are like, yes, does this nation have all the chips that they reported and are allowed to have? Alternatively, are these chips like actually connected in the legal ways? Your like cost isn't too big. Your like bandwidth between chips is like below the legal threshold. Ensuring that the chips haven't been tampered with. No one's like got in there with a screwdriver and like turned off like the safety module. That's very sad. That such thing does not exist. And also like checking the security of like the data center. I think inspections of chip fabs are like pretty awesome and seem pretty essential for various things. This is like mainly useful in the worlds where there are like agreements only to produce certain types of chips. For example, only with these like certain hardware-enabled mechanisms. The goal here is to ensure that the fab is only producing like compliant chips, and so like all of the AGI capable chips in the world have these hardware-enabled mechanisms. And if you can do that, for example, if you can like track the location of all powerful chips, I think we're in like a pretty great world. And you can also,
do you have a sense of like the automation potential of these kinds of inspections? Like when I think of like nuclear weapons inspection, that you have this image in my mind of like a person going in and kind of like seeing if anybody's hiding like the uranium manufacturing behind some fake wall. But like since fabs seem so much more, I don't know, like it seems harder to do that. I'm wondering if it's possible to like automate this process in some way.
Interesting. I mean, I haven't thought too much. I think it's like plausible. I mean, the main thing I imagine a person doing here is like a person like goes into the fab, maybe like a kind of short notice, and just like picks a chip off the conveyor belt and is like, is it compliant? It doesn't have like the mechanisms that we require. I think maybe you can have like some kind of like automated surveillance system where like we're just like looking, see like other people like kind of acting in reasonable ways. But yeah, it seems more. Yeah, I don't know. It seems more difficult to automate the process, but I'm not super confident here. Ideally, we can automate as much of this as possible, because I know this like the more that we automate, the more you have to like rely on certain like you have to rely on like nations trusting each other with inspectors or whatever, rather you like trust your automated system.
And we do have a question from BC. On hardware-enabled mechanisms, which hardware-enabled mechanism would you prioritize pushing development up in order to make an international treaty more likely to happen? And like, I think this is an additional either follow-up or explanation. How much less likely is an international treaty to come about without new on-chip mechanisms?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll get to like hardware-enabled mechanisms later in the talk. I think the things that I'm like most excited about are in some sense the most basic. I'm like, yes, so your chip should have like flop counts on them, so the chip knows how many flops it's done. And also, I'm pretty excited about location verification, specifically because location verification works really well with inspections, because it means that you actually know where your data center is, and it's like hard to hide it in a cave somewhere. Yeah, so this is inspections of chip fabs. Yeah, as I was saying, we should also, inspections should also require that like all hardware leaving the fab is like tracked appropriately, and like check the fab security to make sure like, I know no one's like getting in there and like messing with your mechanisms. Ideally, we have inspections of AI labs. This feels like kind of a bunch more of a lift, and probably requires like inspecting the algorithms that like the scientists are writing, which definitely requires like much more intense coordination. This would like require the US to be okay with like Chinese inspectors looking at their code, and like vice versa. And like potentially this involves like people being okay with sharing algorithmic secrets between nations. On priors, this seems like kind of risky, and it seems like hard to do. But in like worlds where like everyone's like, wow, this AI thing really scary, and we need this to trust each other, maybe this is plausible. Less of an ask, I think, is just like checking the AI lab security to make sure just like I don't know, make sure everyone's like up to the standards and no one can like steal the models. And then like finally inspections, although maybe you shouldn't really call them inspections, are inspections of AI models. I think this is basically just evaluations where like inspectors come in and like look at the models and like run specific evaluations. The specific treaties will obviously like determine the level of access given. For example, is this like API access? Is this fine tuning? You have access to the full model and all its internals. Obviously, like the more access you have, the larger risk there is of like sharing algorithmic secrets. I'm pretty excited about AI automated evaluations here. Like you can imagine that you develop like this like AI automated evaluations bot, which is able to run these evaluations and like hopefully avoids like leaking like algorithmic secrets to the other side. I think it's maybe a pretty good intervention would be for the US and China to develop this like AI automated evaluations bot together, such that they like both trust it and both trust that it's not going to like unfairly bias to one side. And if they just both develop it together, hopefully you can do this without like sharing additional algorithmic secrets. But yeah, I think this also requires like much more powerful AI systems than we like have today. Cool. Kind of related to inspections is the idea of continuous monitoring. So this was the thing that like surprised me when learning about these like START treaties. Is that in the first START treaty, US and Russia just had inspectors permanently stationed in certain facilities, like 24/7, because otherwise these facilities were like pretty hard to verify. And this was pretty surprising to me. Like nations were just like pretty willing to, or like reasonably willing to just have like Russian inspectors there, just kind of constantly looking at various things that were going on. In the case of AI, this would likely look like US personnel maintaining a continuous presence in certain Chinese facilities and vice versa. For example, these like inspectors could be like making sure that a training run isn't getting too big, making sure that like someone isn't using like an already trained model as an initialization for another model to get like around the flop counts, things like this, which is the kind of thing that you need someone to be there like kind of constantly to make sure no one's like taking like single actions to like skirt around like the agreements. And there's probably also like a cheaper way to do this, which is just having just like live camera feeds, although like this definitely like makes it harder to catch all the things. Obviously there's some like difficulty here with like how much access do you give these like permanently stationed inspectors. Nice. And related to this, there's also like just like data sharing. I think data sharing is also just a pretty common part of these treaties, where you just like kind of tell each nation tells the other one like, where are you at? How good are your things? Are you lying to us? Like, are you like breaking the rules? For example, in the START treaties, there were agreements about sharing missile telemetry data. Be like, how fast are your missiles? I don't know, what's their acceleration? Blah blah blah. Such that like each nation could verify that the other one wasn't like exceeding like the agreed upon capabilities. Yeah. In the same vein for AI, I think you can just do this with like various things. You can do this. Each nation reports flop counts or other training statistics like training loss, power consumption, kind of thing. I think most relevantly, they would like report like evaluations results, be like, yes, are your models like getting too good? If you're getting too good, the treaty requires that we like stop, or at least we like discuss some things. And then potentially also algorithmic details. Be like, what are you doing? How are your models working? Are we all cool with this? But yeah, I don't know exactly how this would work. I think also data sharing would likely be backed up by like inspections and continuous monitoring to like ensure that like the data being sent is actually like accurate and not just fabricated, which is always like a risk with this kind of thing. And then zooming out, you can use satellite imagery. Again, this is the kind of thing that's very commonly used for nuclear verification. You know, you could like use the satellite imagery and be like, yes, that looks like a nuclear weapons production facility, or these look like centrifuges. You should like go in and investigate that. I think this could pretty easily be used to find like chip fabs to ensure that there are like no untracked fabs in the forest somewhere producing non-compliant chips. This could be used for finding data centers. Specifically, like, and it's much easier to find the data centers if you have these like on-chip location verification mechanisms that I'll get to in a bit. I think without those other mechanisms, it seems pretty brutal, because I think you can pretty easily hide a data center either like underground somewhere or just like it's just a building. It's kind of hard to tell exactly which building is a data center from satellite imagery. Plausibly, future models will require extremely large amounts of electricity, though. And so, therefore, you can possibly also just look for power plants and then like things that look like data centers hooked up to power plants. And I think it seems like pretty difficult to like hide a power plant. And so that'll like, hopefully gives you some impression for where these things are, especially the most like powerful data centers. And now we get on to hardware-enabled mechanisms. Hooray! So yeah, these hardware-enabled mechanisms are things like hardware mechanisms built like into the chips themselves, which allow like specific governance actions. I think these things are mainly useful in the case where like currently built hardware and hardware built in the near future isn't sufficient for building dangerous AI. And so like the dangerous or like the powerful AI is built on basically an entirely new hardware stack. And when we do that, we can like make sure this hardware includes these like hardware enabled mechanisms. I'll describe like these in like kind of brief detail because a lot of them, and like hardware enabled mechanisms is like a whole thing. I really thoroughly recommend these things that I've linked. And I think hardware enabled mechanisms are pretty exciting. I think one's
Is it alright if we share links to these in the seminar channel?
Seems great.
All right, great.
I thoroughly endorse everybody reading this. Yeah. I think one interesting thing to note is that hardware-enabled mechanisms are like AI specific. Like they're kind of unique to AI while the other things that we've discussed in this talk are just like kind of normal things that you do during like other verification schemes. But these are things that like a specific governance lever that we have when dealing with AI, which would not be really like applicable to nuclear or wouldn't really be applicable to like bio or whatever. In general, a bunch of these can be circumvented by like physical means, but hopefully then you have like inspections on top of that who can go look at your chips and be like, yes, sure, looks like you attacked this chip with a screwdriver. You're breaking the rules. Cool, so now I'll briefly run through various mechanisms which seem pretty useful. So there's the idea of operating licenses. And so these would potentially allow like a GPU to operate at full capacity only for a limited time, after which this like license gets renewed. And plausibly this license is like tied to some like inspection, such that you're like, yes, you can like train this much of a model, but like then we're going to come in and make sure you're like still playing by the rules, and then you can continue. We can like limit the specific like code or models that chips can run to make sure you're like only running like code or models that like for some reason our international like organization has deemed to be safe. This is the idea of the fixed set, which is like designing chips such that they can only be networked together in relatively like small pods. And so, for example, you wouldn't be able to like get your like 100,000 H100s in a single cluster. Rather, you're only like lump your H100s in like clusters of 100 or something. There's location verification techniques, which I'll get to in a bit and discuss more of, which hopefully allow you to see at least very approximately where these chips are and like make it harder for you to hide your data centers. There's tamper-proof mechanisms such that either the chip breaks if someone tampers with it, or at least makes it very obvious to inspectors if the chips have been tampered with. We have these physical unclonable functions, which is like somewhat a mouthful, but these can be used to give chips unique identifiers based on manufacturing variations, and so therefore each chip is like assigned like a specific number which like isn't fakeable, and so you can like kind of give it each chip a number and make sure everyone's has the chips that they're allowed to have. And you can also have like various flop counting or other metering things, so you can be like, yes, have your chips performed like the allowed number of flops? Are you like abiding by all your like flop regulations? Cool. So now we can go into a bit more detail on what flop accounting means. I mean, I think this is like probably the most basic, or like one of the most basic things that a treaty could like require, and seems like hopefully a thing that we do eventually. And like this mainly works in the case where like everyone's agreed we won't train a model above a certain flop threshold. In this like case, we get the AI labs to record where they've spent all their flops, and then you have the chips themselves record these, and hopefully these numbers line up, and you're like, yes, you probably didn't lie about where you spent your flops. You can also use some other proxies for flops, such as like data center power consumption, but this is like much less accurate, although it would not require like building new chips. There are also these like proof of learning protocols, such as discussed in this like what does it take to catch a chinchilla paper, which I think is pretty great, which like creates some like approximate training transcript and kind of, at least to some extent, provides some assurance that flops were spent training the specific model. And so you can like be relatively confident that flops weren't spent on something else. Next, and now we have this idea of these unique identifiers on hardware. Some like pretty basic idea here is just to have each like GPU assigned a unique barcode, like when it's manufactured. And then like inspectors can like test these. They go in, scan the barcode, and be like, yep, US, you're allowed to have this barcode. It's in the international repository. Good stuff. Obviously, this doesn't solve the problem of someone like copying the barcodes. So you can be confident that like, yes, you're allowed to have like a GPU with this barcode of it, but you don't know that they've like copied the barcode and put it on a bunch of other GPUs. You can get around this problem using these like physical unclonable functions that I mentioned before, which can create these like unique identifiers based on specific hardware variations. And so I think are basically impossible to fake. And so using this, your barcode number would be like based on like the specific hardware that you have. And then you have to verify this by like actually like opening up the chip, looking inside, checking that like its physical properties match the number that it has. And I think just doing this, you can basically guarantee that the chip is what it says it is, and that a various nation is like allowed to have it. Yeah, so this seems pretty great if we can do it. And when you're like, hopefully when you do this, you only need to like scan a bunch, like a certain number of chips, like maybe like, I don't know, 10 or something, before you're like, it seems like none of the chips that we scanned are like, are illegal. It seems like you're probably complying with the rules. There's also this idea of location verification. As I've been mentioning this whole time, I love inspections. And these inspections, among other things, rely on knowing where the key facilities are. You can't like inspect the data center if you don't know where it is. And so some location verification mechanisms can use like a ping or like delay-based system where like where someone in some server around the world sends a signal to the chip sends it back, and then like based on the delay for that, you can get some idea for approximately where the chip is located in the world. Now these can be like very imprecise, but can potentially be combined with other things such as information about like satellite imagery to hopefully give like a rough idea where the chips are. Yeah, again, like the main goal here is to like be confident that there isn't this like a secret AGI capable data center hidden in a cave somewhere, because you know kind of like where they are based on these location verification mechanisms. Cool. Somewhat of a much more ambitious proposal is centralizing all of the compute. This is somewhat of a crazy, more extreme plan. But I don't know, seems like a thing maybe we should be thinking about at least a little bit. It could plausibly look like this infrastructure as a service proposal, where basically the US or someone basically owns all the infrastructure, like in the same way the US is currently extremely dominant in GPU production. They own all of the infrastructure, and they just like rent this to China or something, and agree for China not to build up domestic capacity in exchange for having access to this like infrastructure as a service platform. Or alternatively, you could have your like big world data center, I don't know, in Switzerland or something, where everyone agrees like this is the neutral data center, and we all agree to like run our things here, and everyone can veto everyone else's things, and hopefully you can do some coordination around this. Yeah.
Question from the chat. Delay-based location verification. How would you communicate with satellite if you're in a hardened, air-gapped data center in a cave? Is the idea that chips wouldn't power on anywhere where they're not line of sight with some kind of receiver?
Yeah, so I think the idea behind this location verification stuff is that the chip only works if it's like sending and receiving this signal. So maybe it'll only run for like maybe a minute or something before powering off if it doesn't receive this like external like signal. And this means that like, this is the kind of thing we would need new chips to do this, because current chips definitely don't have this like as part of their hardware. Cool. Yes, I know the centralized compute seems kind of extreme, but like it seems great if we can do it, although I'm certainly not particularly hopeful. As much as I like love the Baruch plan, I think kind of intense centralized efforts might fail, although seem like kind of like the ideal setup if we can like properly achieve them. I think there's maybe something to be said here that like the US does in fact currently have like a crazy lead in hardware manufacturing, or the US and its allies, specifically Taiwan. And so maybe you can use this to like allow some like US led compute centralization effort. Although obviously the US needs to be on board with this, which seems like another amount of a lift. Nice. Cool. So that's the list of a bunch of the verification mechanisms around like, I don't know, verification and confidence building AI. I think notably there are a bunch of things which like just don't have analogies to AI. AI unfortunately isn't radioactive. It's not like made of interesting chemicals, and there aren't like explosions. And so this makes like other verification schemes related to nuclear, biochemical stuff like not always super applicable. Like you can't just like measure some chemicals from the environment. You can't just like measure how radioactive something is and be like, yes, this thing is this radioactive. That means it was trained with this many flops. Unfortunately, these things don't work. And you also can't be like, yes, the ground vibrated this amount. Your explosion was this big. Yeah, unfortunately, AI, all the stuff is like run on a computer. And so this makes a bunch of these like physical measurement stuff much less effective. But yeah, that's the end of this talk. Includes the overview of mechanisms, which I think could be useful for verification and confidence building around advanced AI. No doubt I'll have missed some of these. I'm excited if you want to have like other ideas for things to add to this list. But I do think there's like pretty exciting and important work to be done here, and like working out how these inspections could work, how much trust is like required in order for things to be effective, and also around these hardware-enabled mechanisms to making sure they actually work and like getting them put onto the chips. I think overall it seems pretty plausible to me that there will be some kind of attempt at international regulation around AGI, or at least this kind of regulation is the kind of thing that's like kind of required for things to go well. Yeah, as I've been saying throughout this talk, these kind of like agreements really do require everyone, all the nations in the agreement, to believe that no one else is defecting, or at least not defecting too hard. And so you really need to be able to build this confidence to avoid falling into this like defect equilibrium. Yeah, the specific verification mechanisms that are useful will obviously depend on like the specific agreements that are made. But I hope that I provided like something of an overview to be like, yes, here's the potential kind of, at least some of the menu of mechanisms that could be used here. We've got this like range of general tools from like previous verification regimes, such as like inspections, satellite imagery, and data sharing. And then we also have a bunch of AI-specific mechanisms, particularly in the form of hardware-enabled mechanisms. Yeah, I want to end by saying that I'm like pretty excited about international coordination. I think this thing like hopefully can work, but it certainly will require like sufficient verification and therefore confidence for things to go well. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. That was really interesting. So you talked a bit about how it seems a little bit harder if you're thinking about sort of offense-defense balance of what the detection versus deception is going to be. You said it's going to be a bit harder than nuclear because there are no seismometers, there's no environmental sampling. Do you have a sense more like projecting this out 10 years, like, yeah, where you think that will land without that sort of physical advantage of the fact that radiation is kind of really hard to conceal. You talked a lot about like very clever tools for trying to like audit and detect things, but I imagine there's also going to be very clever tools for deceiving and finding ways to hide them. So where do you think that balance will end up?
I agree, it's pretty brutal. I think the key advantage that we have with AI is that, at least given current paradigms, and maybe this changes, it does require like large amounts of extremely like technologically advanced chips. And these can only be produced in like a few facilities, currently in Taiwan, but I expect maybe soon in China. We'll see how that goes. And because like the key technology is like pretty easy to centralize, and you can, I'm pretty excited, like pretty confident that you'll always be able to be like, yes, your fab is there, we're allowed to inspect this. I think there's going to be like quite a lot of ability to make sure that like all the hardware produced is compliant, given that everyone, at least on paper, agrees to these agreements. I think it's definitely a very different question as to whether people actually do. It's definitely like quite a large ask to be like, yes, all of your chips above a certain flop threshold, or like flop threshold, have to have these specific mechanisms on them. And so I think this requires like pretty intense. I know everyone being like pretty worried about the risks in order to get these agreements. I don't know exactly where this like balances out. It does seem my like instinct is that this is like slightly easier than nuclear, conditional on people agreeing to do this like regulation around hardware enabled mechanisms.
I guess there are some disanalogies with the nuclear case that make me less optimistic about treaties in the AI case. So in particular, in the nuclear case, defection just doesn't seem that attractive. It's like you then get to spend a bunch of your country's R&D budget on getting more warheads, but like you're still in mutually assured destruction and the other country still has second strike capability. So like, doesn't seem that great. And the situation is symmetric for both countries.
Yeah.
In the AI case, you're agreeing to like intentionally impoverish yourself just to spite your neighbor. And that seems like sort of a higher cost of compliance. And then also, it seems more likely that one country will have good information that it could sort of win insofar as like winning the race is a meaningful thing. So it seems harder to sustain cooperation in this case to me. I'm curious what you make of this.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is pretty brutal. Yeah, there is certainly the thing that like nuclear weapons are mainly good for like blowing things up, while AI is a general purpose technology, and 20% GDP growth plausibly seems pretty awesome. And so yeah, I think there will be like pretty strong incentives here. Yeah, I think this kind of agreement does basically rely on countries like waking up to at least like extreme risks, probably misalignment risks from AI. To be like, oh wow, this stuff seems extremely dangerous. Even though like the upside is great, we do need to like attempt to regulate this kind of thing.
That's the I'm curious why like domestic regulation won't be sufficient. Like if both China and the US have woken to misalignment risk, like why do you need international treaties on top of the domestic regulation that they'll do independently?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some like you're like oh yes, alignment's like somewhat real, but like maybe it's still worth racing. Like if you're only somewhat worried about the misalignment risks.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. It just seems like it relies on both countries having a very narrow, very specific kind of risk tolerance, where it would be worth it if they were racing, but not worth it if they were both.
Yeah, I mean, I think this also ties in with this whole like countries not wanting to avoid another country becoming too powerful, which I think like I don't know how likely this is. I don't know if there are like specific precedents here for this kind of thing, but it does seem pretty likely that China really won't be okay with the US becoming like wildly economically dominant, and probably will like take actions to avoid this.
We're going to take a question from chat. Why aren't hardware-enabled mechanisms likely to be useful with the current hardware stack? Is it mainly a timelines thing?
Oh, so this is basically like these hardware-enabled mechanisms are largely like things that are like built onto existing chips. They're not just like downloads that you could like do to like update the software running on them. So you need to like implement like a specific component on the chip at like the hardware level. I think there are some that are like kind of more firmware level, but I like haven't looked into this a ton.
Yeah, that was kind of my question. Like regarding proof of learning, like where do you think the bottleneck is in terms of like needed more engineering? Like how much more engineering is needed before it's ready for prime time? But like the important thing about that question is like what runway is acceptable for a regulator, right? Like how close to prime time does proof of learning has to be in order for a regulator to like demand that the rest of the way be gone?
Yeah. I mean, I agree this is pretty difficult. I think like hardware development times can often be pretty brutal. And so maybe you plausibly need like this technology to be like reasonably like established. I do think like I think nations do like regulations do sometimes like, yes, here's a concept that we know is like physically possible. You'd have to implement that without it being like super tested. But yeah, I'm not super sure here.
I think this is a related question from chat as well. The heads of US, China, and the majority of the UN Security Council were all on board to establish a monitoring regime tomorrow. What's the blocker? Anything we need to build that's missing? What's the smallest / shortest path to success?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think, I guess the thing that I would imagine you'd have to do now is all advanced chips now have certain hardware-enabled mechanisms. Specifically, I guess I would love this like location stuff and also flop counting on the chips to allow for like these like, I know, to allow for flop counting and to allow people to know where the chips are. You need to like establish your like system of inspectors. You need the people who actually know what the hell is going on and like how the chips work and how everything works to also be able to like inspect the stuff. And I expect like training inspectors to like just be a pretty non-trivial part of this job. Yeah.
I've heard that NVIDIA chips have some kind of mechanism to like block crypto mining. Do you know what sort of mechanism that is?
Yeah.
Similar to this.
Yeah, so I think this would fall under like the broad category of hardware-enabled mechanisms. I think this like looks at the kind of operations being done on the chip, like, and it's like, yes, these kind of things like are similar enough to like crypto mining that we're gonna like throttle the speeds doing this. But yeah, I don't know like super specifics here. But I think this is the kind of thing that shows like, yes, people do in fact implement hardware-enabled mechanisms some amount, like to stop chips doing specific things. And so it seems like the kind of thing you can do with AI.
And that's our time today. One more round of applause for Peter.